My husband's parents arranged my accident in Mandarin, not knowing I'd been studying for years. I was arranging flowers in the dining room when I heard Wei and Mei Lin speaking in rapid Mandarin in the kitchen, their voices low but urgent enough to carry through the doorway. Wei said something about the hiking trail at Cascade Falls being perfect because the rocks were always slippery after rain, and there'd be no witnesses on a weekday morning. Mei Lin responded that I always went jogging alone on Thursdays, that it would be easy to suggest a family hike instead, somewhere more dangerous. My hands froze on the vase I was holding as Wei said the insurance policy was for $2 million, and once I was gone, Ryan would inherit everything and they could finally expand the manufacturing business the way they'd always planned. Mei Lin laughed softly and said in Mandarin that I'd been nothing but a burden since Ryan married me, that I didn't even give them grandchildren, and it was time to solve the problem permanently. They switched to English when Ryan walked into the kitchen asking about dinner plans, and I forced myself to keep arranging the lilies with steady hands, even though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'd been studying Mandarin secretly for 3 years using apps and online tutors, originally wanting to surprise Ryan and his family by understanding their conversations, never imagining I'd overhear them plotting my murder. Ryan and I had been married for 5 years, and his parents had moved from Taiwan to live with us 18 months ago, after Wei retired from his factory management position overseas. The plan had been temporary, just until they found their own place, but they'd never left. Our 4-bedroom house in the suburbs had become their domain, with Mei Lin cooking elaborate dinners and rearranging furniture, while Wei sat in the den reading Chinese newspapers and making business calls. Ryan was their only child, born when they were in their 40s, and they'd built their entire lives around ensuring his success. He ran a small import company that his father had started 20 years ago, bringing electronics and textiles from Taiwan to distribute in the Pacific Northwest. The business was profitable but modest, nothing compared to what Wei had managed in his prime. I'd heard them pressure Ryan constantly about expanding, about taking bigger risks, about investing in manufacturing facilities that required capital we didn't have. Now I understood why they'd suddenly stopped pressuring him and started being unusually nice to me over the past few weeks. They'd been planning this. I called my best friend Sophie that evening from my car, parked at a grocery store where I'd gone to get away from the house and think clearly. My voice shook as I told her what I'd overheard, speaking quietly even though I was alone. Sophie worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm, and she immediately stopped me and said I needed to report this to the police right now, that this was a credible threat against my life. I explained that I had no proof beyond what I'd heard, that it would be my word against theirs, and they could easily claim I'd misunderstood or that they'd been joking. Sophie was quiet for a moment before saying I needed to document everything, record their conversations, and gather evidence before going to authorities. She said her firm had dealt with cases where family members made threats that police couldn't act on without concrete proof, and I'd need to be strategic. I asked if she could recommend an attorney who specialized in this kind of situation, and she said she'd call me back within an hour. I sat in the grocery store parking lot staring at the steering wheel and trying to process that my husband's parents were actively planning to kill me for insurance money. Sophie called back with a name and number for Patricia Vega, a criminal defense attorney who also handled protective orders and family law matters involving threats. I called Patricia's office the next morning while Wei and Mei Lin were at a doctor's appointment and Ryan was at work. Patricia's assistant scheduled me for an emergency consultation that afternoon, and I drove downtown feeling the surreal disconnect of going about normal life while knowing someone was planning my death. Patricia's office was in a high-rise with a view of the bay, and she met me in a conference room with glass walls and modern furniture. I told her everything I'd overheard, explaining that I understood Mandarin but had kept it secret from my husband's family. Patricia took notes on a legal pad and asked detailed questions about the insurance policy, about who would benefit from my death, about any previous incidents that might establish a pattern. I told her there'd been small things over the past month that I'd dismissed as accidents. A loose stair railing that could have sent me tumbling down to the basement. Medication in the bathroom cabinet that wasn't mine and could have been dangerous if I'd taken it by mistake. A gas burner left on overnight that I'd discovered when I woke up to a strange smell. Patricia explained that what I described could constitute conspiracy to commit murder, but proving it would require substantial evidence. She said recordings of their conversations would be crucial, but I needed to check state law about consent for recording. Washington was a 2-party consent state, which meant recording someone without their knowledge could be illegal unless I was part of the conversation, or it happened in my own home where I had a reasonable expectation that conversations might be overheard. She suggested I install security cameras in common areas of my house, explaining that homeowners generally had the right to surveil their own property, and that audio recording in shared spaces was typically legal. Patricia also recommended hiring a private investigator to document my in-laws' activities and communications, particularly any evidence they might be researching methods of causing fatal accidents. She said I should not confront them or let them know I was aware of their plans, that my safety depended on them continuing to believe I was an ignorant target. The consultation lasted 2 hours and cost me $800 that I paid from a credit card they didn't know I had. Patricia gave me a card for an investigator named David Brenner and told me to call him immediately. David Brenner's office was above a pawn shop in a neighborhood that made me nervous, but Sophie had said Patricia only recommended people she trusted completely. David was in his 50s with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd seen every possible version of human betrayal. I told him the situation, and he didn't seem surprised or skeptical, just pulled out a notebook and started asking practical questions. He said he could conduct surveillance on Wei and Mei Lin to document their activities and contacts, and he could also run background checks to see if they had any history of insurance fraud or suspicious incidents. David explained that his fee was $1,500 as a retainer plus expenses, and I agreed without hesitation, even though it would drain most of my personal savings. He said he'd start immediately and would check in with me every few days. I asked if he thought I was overreacting, if maybe I'd misunderstood what I'd heard, and David looked at me with tired eyes and said people who planned to murder family members for money were more common than anyone wanted to believe. He told me to trust my instincts and protect myself, that it was better to be wrong about a threat than dead because I'd dismissed it. I installed the security system that weekend while Wei and Mei Lin were visiting friends in Seattle and Ryan was playing golf. The cameras were small and discreet, hidden in smoke detectors and shelf decorations in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. Each one recorded both video and audio, backing up to a cloud storage account that only I could access. I tested every camera twice and watched the feeds on my phone to make sure the audio quality was clear enough to capture conversations. When everyone came home, I acted normal and cheerful, asking about their days and cooking dinner while my phone recorded everything from the kitchen camera. That night, after Ryan fell asleep, I sat in the bathroom scrolling through the day's footage and listening to Wei and Mei Lin's conversations. They spoke mostly in Mandarin when Ryan wasn't around, and I heard Mei Lin talking about hiking trails again, saying she'd researched several locations that would be perfect for an accident. Wei mentioned that they needed to move forward soon because Ryan was starting to question why they hadn't found their own apartment yet, and it would be harder to execute their plan once they moved out. Ryan had no idea what his parents were planning. He was a good man who loved his family and trusted them completely, and the thought of telling him that his parents wanted me dead felt impossible. How do you tell someone that the people who raised them are capable of murder? I watched him sleep that night and felt grief wash over me for what this would eventually do to him. He'd defended his parents constantly over the past 18 months whenever I'd expressed frustration with them living in our house. He'd explained their cultural expectations and their desire to be close to family, never imagining they were staying to plot my murder. Part of me wanted to wake him up and show him everything I'd learned, but Patricia had warned me that confronting family members with conspiracy allegations often led to them closing ranks and destroying evidence. I needed to be patient and gather proof that was undeniable before revealing what I knew. David called me Monday afternoon while I was at work and asked if I could meet him at a coffee shop near my office. I left early and found him at a corner table with a manila folder. He slid it across to me and I opened it to find photographs of Wei meeting with a man I didn't recognize at a restaurant in Chinatown. David explained that the man was named Liang Wu, and he had a criminal record including assault and fraud convictions from 15 years ago. David had followed Wei to 3 meetings with Liang over the past week, always at different restaurants, always paying in cash. He'd managed to get close enough at the last meeting to record part of their conversation on a directional microphone. He pulled out his phone and played me an audio file where Wei was speaking in Mandarin about timing and payment, and Liang was asking questions about my routine and whether I lived alone. My hands started shaking and David told me to breathe, that this was good evidence, but we needed more before going to police. I asked David what he thought Liang's role was, and he said based on the conversation, it sounded like Wei was hiring him to cause my accident rather than doing it himself. This made tactical sense because it would give Wei and Mei Lin distance from the actual crime, and they could claim shock and grief when I died. David said he'd continue surveillance on both Wei and Liang to document their planning and hopefully catch them discussing specific details. He warned me to be extremely careful and to vary my routine, avoid being alone in isolated places, and trust my instincts if anything felt wrong. I told him about the security cameras I'd installed, and he said that was smart, that I should also start documenting everything my in-laws said or did that seemed suspicious. I left the coffee shop feeling simultaneously more afraid and more empowered. At least now I knew the threat was real and I had professionals helping me gather evidence. That evening, Wei and Mei Lin were unusually friendly during dinner. Mei Lin had made my favorite dish, beef noodle soup, and kept serving me more while asking about my day in careful English. Wei smiled and said they'd been thinking about taking a family trip soon, maybe to the mountains for some hiking since the weather was getting nicer. He suggested Cascade Falls specifically, saying he'd heard it was beautiful this time of year. My stomach clenched, but I smiled and said that sounded lovely, that I'd always wanted to visit that area. Ryan was enthusiastic, saying it would be great for his parents to see more of Washington. After dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom and checked my phone where the security camera feed showed Mei Lin and Wei speaking in Mandarin in the kitchen. Mei Lin was saying that I'd agreed to the hiking trip too easily, that maybe I was suspicious. Wei told her not to worry, that I was too trusting and naive to suspect anything. They discussed whether to proceed with the hiking plan or wait for a better opportunity. Wei said Liang could make it look like an accident anywhere, that the hiking trail was just the easiest location to arrange something without witnesses. I forwarded the security camera footage to Patricia and David that night from my car again, sitting in a grocery store parking lot that had become my refuge for making private calls and reviewing evidence. Patricia called me back within an hour and said the footage was excellent evidence of conspiracy, and combined with David's surveillance of Wei meeting with Liang, we were building a strong case. She said I needed to decide whether to go to police now or wait for more evidence, explaining that each option had risks. If I went to police immediately, they might not have enough to arrest Wei and Mei Lin, and my in-laws would know I'd understood their Mandarin conversations and was working against them. If I waited for more evidence, I continued living with people actively planning my murder. I told Patricia I wanted to wait at least another week to gather more concrete proof, particularly if David could record Wei and Liang discussing specific plans. She made me promise to stay in public places as much as possible and to tell someone I trusted exactly where I was at all times. Sophie came over the next morning after I texted her asking if she could work from my house for the day. She brought her laptop and we set up in my home office while Wei and Mei Lin were out shopping. I showed her all the security footage and played her the audio of Wei meeting with Liang. Sophie looked horrified and said I needed to move out immediately, that staying in the house was insane. I explained Patricia's advice about gathering evidence, and Sophie argued that evidence wasn't worth my life. She said I could stay with her and her husband until this was resolved, and I was tempted but worried that leaving suddenly would alert my in-laws that I knew their plans. We compromised on Sophie checking in with me every few hours through a code system. If I texted her anything with the word coffee, she'd know I was in danger and would call police immediately. She also insisted I carry pepper spray and a personal alarm, which she ordered from Amazon for immediate delivery. Ryan came home early that afternoon and found Sophie and me working in the office. He looked pleased to see us together, knowing I'd been lonely with his parents always in the house and not giving me space. He suggested we all go out for dinner as a family, including his parents, and I agreed while calculating how to use this as an opportunity to record more conversations. At the restaurant, Wei and Mei Lin were charming to Sophie, asking about her work and complimenting her dress. After we ordered, Mei Lin excused herself to use the restroom and I followed after a minute, hoping to catch her making a phone call. She was washing her hands when I entered, and she smiled at me in the mirror. She said in English that it was nice to see me spending time with friends, that family was important, but so were other relationships. I thanked her and went into a stall, pulling out my phone to record audio. I heard her make a call speaking Mandarin, and my blood went cold as I listened to her telling someone they'd confirmed the hiking trip for next Sunday, that everything needed to be ready. David's surveillance over the next week captured Wei meeting with Liang 2 more times and documented Liang driving to Cascade Falls twice, apparently scouting the location. David managed to photograph Liang at the waterfall examining the trail, taking pictures of the rocky areas and measuring distances. He said in his professional opinion, Liang was planning some kind of physical assault that would make my death look like an accidental fall. David strongly advised me to refuse the hiking trip under any circumstances and to consider going to police immediately with what we'd gathered. The evidence was substantial. Recorded conversations of Wei and Mei Lin discussing my death, photographs of Wei meeting with a man with a criminal record, surveillance footage of that same man scouting the location they'd mentioned, and audio of Mei Lin confirming plans over the phone. Patricia agreed when I called her that evening. She said it was time to involve law enforcement before the planned date arrived. I met with Detective Raymond Foster at the police department downtown on a Friday morning, bringing Patricia with me. Raymond was in his 40s with a direct manner that made me feel immediately safer. I showed him everything I'd gathered, the security camera footage with transcriptions of the Mandarin conversations I'd translated, David's surveillance photos and recordings, the evidence of Liang's criminal background, and my timeline of suspicious incidents over the past month. Raymond reviewed everything carefully and asked detailed questions about who had access to my house, what the insurance policy details were, and whether Ryan was aware of his parents' plans. I told him I was certain Ryan knew nothing, that he loved me and would never hurt me. Raymond said he needed to verify the insurance policy information and do more research on Liang, but based on what I'd provided, he believed I had grounds for a protective order at minimum. He said he'd also be opening a criminal investigation into conspiracy to commit murder, and he'd need to interview Wei and Mei Lin separately. The protective order hearing happened that Monday. Patricia filed an emergency petition on my behalf, and the judge reviewed my evidence in chambers. Wei and Mei Lin weren't present because emergency protective orders could be issued without the respondents being notified initially, with a full hearing scheduled later where they could contest it. The judge granted the order immediately, requiring Wei and Mei Lin to move out of my house within 24 hours and stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. Raymond coordinated with patrol officers to serve the order that afternoon while I stayed at work with Sophie. Ryan called me 3 times, confused and upset, asking what was happening. I told him I'd explain everything that evening and asked him to meet me at Sophie's house rather than our home. He agreed reluctantly, his voice tight with worry. Telling Ryan was the hardest thing I've ever done. He sat in Sophie's living room while I played him the security camera footage and showed him the evidence I'd gathered. He watched his parents discussing my death in Mandarin, not knowing I'd understood every word. He looked at photographs of his father meeting with a criminal to arrange my murder. He listened to his mother confirming plans over the phone. His face went through shock, denial, and then horror as the evidence became undeniable. He kept saying there had to be a mistake, that his parents would never do this, but the footage was time-stamped and clear. When I showed him the translation of what they'd said about me being a burden, and their plan to use the insurance money to expand his business, he put his face in his hands and cried. He said he'd spent his whole life defending them, believing they wanted the best for our family, never imagining they were capable of this. I held him while he processed the fact that his parents had planned to murder his wife. Ryan moved out of our house that night, unable to face going back there while his parents were packing their belongings. He stayed with his college friend Nathan for a few days while Wei and Mei Lin got an apartment across town, complying with the protective order but maintaining their innocence to anyone who would listen. Ryan's phone filled with calls from his parents saying I'd misunderstood everything, that there'd been a terrible miscommunication, that they'd been discussing a movie plot or gossiping about someone else. Ryan didn't answer their calls. He hired his own attorney and cooperated fully with Raymond's investigation, providing access to the insurance policy documents and his parents' financial records. The policy was indeed for $2 million, purchased 3 years ago with Ryan as the sole beneficiary. If I died, Ryan would inherit the money, and as his parents constantly reminded him, they expected him to care for them financially in their old age as Chinese cultural values demanded. The criminal investigation moved faster than I expected. Raymond discovered that Liang Wu had been paid $15,000 in cash by Wei over the past month, deposited into his bank account in small increments. When confronted by police, Liang initially claimed the money was for consulting work, but under pressure, he admitted Wei had hired him to cause my fatal accident at Cascade Falls. Liang said he was supposed to push me off the trail during the hike while making it look like I'd slipped on wet rocks. He'd been promised another $10,000 after my death. Liang agreed to testify against Wei and Mei Lin in exchange for a reduced sentence on the conspiracy charge. Raymond arrested Wei and Mei Lin on a Thursday morning at their new apartment. I wasn't present, but Ryan told me later that his mother had collapsed crying, and his father had insisted this was all a misunderstanding until confronted with Liang's testimony. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Local news stations ran stories about the immigrant parents who'd plotted to kill their daughter-in-law for insurance money. Cable news picked it up as an example of cultural conflict and family greed. Reporters camped outside our house and tried to interview Ryan when he went to work. Our story went viral on social media with thousands of comments debating whether this was about money, culture, or pure evil. I read comments from people who'd had difficult relationships with in-laws saying they now questioned whether small incidents had been more sinister than they'd realized. Some commenters blamed me for marrying into a culture I didn't understand. Others praised me for learning Mandarin and protecting myself. The attention was overwhelming and surreal, turning my private trauma into public entertainment. The trial happened 6 months later. Wei and Mei Lin both pleaded not guilty, and their defense attorney argued that the conversations I'd recorded were taken out of context, that they'd been discussing hypothetical scenarios or venting frustrations without any real intent to harm me. The attorney claimed Liang was lying to reduce his own sentence and that the money Wei had paid him was for legitimate import business consulting. The prosecution played the security camera footage in court with my voice providing live translation of the Mandarin conversations. I sat on the witness stand for 2 days describing what I'd heard and how I'd gathered evidence while living with people who wanted me dead. The jury watched Wei meeting with Liang in surveillance photos. They heard Mei Lin confirming plans over the phone. They saw Liang's photographs of Cascade Falls where he'd been planning to push me to my death. The defense tried to discredit my translation skills, bringing in their own Mandarin expert, but he confirmed my translations were accurate. Wei and Mei Lin were convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years each in state prison. Liang received 8 years for his cooperation. The judge said during sentencing that he'd seen many cases of family members harming each other over money, but the calculated planning and deception in this case was particularly disturbing. He noted that Wei and Mei Lin had lived in my home while plotting my death, eating meals with me and pretending affection, all while waiting for the right moment to execute their plan. He said they'd betrayed not just me but their own son, and that their actions would ripple through the family for generations. Ryan sat in the courtroom gallery during the sentencing and didn't look at his parents when they were led away in handcuffs. Ryan and I stayed married through all of it, though our relationship was forever changed by what his parents had done. We sold the house where I'd recorded their conspiracy and moved to a smaller place across town, wanting a fresh start in a space without those memories. Ryan went to therapy to process the betrayal and the complicated grief of losing his parents not to death, but to their own evil choices. He eventually took over the import business completely, cutting his parents out of any financial involvement and restructuring the company to focus on ethical practices. He never visited Wei or Mei Lin in prison, despite their letters begging him to understand that they'd only wanted to secure his future. I forgave him for bringing them into our lives, understanding he'd been raised by people who'd hidden their true natures even from him. Some days the trauma of those months catches up with me, and I have nightmares about what would have happened if I hadn't understood Mandarin, if I hadn't overheard their plans, if I'd gone on that hiking trip at Cascade Falls trusting the people who wanted me dead. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.